Ladies and gentlemen, if you would be seated at this time. Kyle, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Prescott family and OMRF, it's my honor to welcome all of you to this morning. My name is Jane Giroux Gamble. I am not a minister, and I'm not a scientist. I'm a friend and a neighbor. And when Susan called and asked me if I would facilitate this service, it was my privilege, truly, to say yes to that request and to join in paying tribute to this remarkable human being, Dr. Stephen Prescott. It's really hard to say goodbye. But it's easy to find joy in the celebration of a life that's so well lived, with such a legacy of amazing accomplishments and profound love. Steve Prescott was a gift to all of us, a gift that will keep on giving for generations to come, through his own research, through his leadership here at this great research institution, through his leadership in Oklahoma City and in Oklahoma, through his friendship with all of us, through his demonstrated love for all of life, and of course, through his love for Susan and his family, whom he adored. Thank God for Steve and for the assurance from our Lord that in Steve's passing, we have not lost him, because love cannot die, nor will his influence. Now, Steve loves singing hymns and reading the Bible. So in searching for a scripture today, I couldn't get beyond a very familiar one that I'd like to share. But I read it differently as I thought of this optimistic and fun-loving man who was refreshed by nature when they visited their cabin in Utah, who loved people and found enormous pleasure, both professionally and personally, in helping them, who I think would say to us today that his life was blessed and overflowing with goodness and love. So I'd like to read the beautiful words of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Forever. Amen. It's my pleasure now to introduce the Vice President of Research for OMRF, Rod McKeever.
Good morning. Steve Prescott was born in Bryant, Texas. 12 days later, I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. So Steve was always senior to me. Now, Steve grew up in Texas. I grew up around Texas. first in Louisiana, then in Mississippi, and then at age 11, my family moved to Oklahoma City, where I went through high school. So I became an Oklahoman. Now, Texans and Oklahomans are like siblings in a family. They tussle and they fight and they argue and they brag about who's the smartest and who's the strongest, but in the end, they're still family. They're from the same area, and in fact, there are lots of blood ties between people in the two states, and I have to confess, my parents are Texans. They grew up in Hillsboro, which is between Waco and Dallas. And when I grew up, I was frequently in Texas visiting grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins all over the state. So you could say that when I finally met Steve, it was going to be easy to connect because we shared a lot. And we did, and that's true. But it ignores a basic truth about Steve, which is that he connected with people from everywhere, all walks of life, all backgrounds. It was who he was. He was interested in people. He learned from them. And he developed wisdom. So Steve and I met only after we grew up. It was 1979. It was in St. Louis, Missouri at Washington University Medical Center. It was a pivotal time for both of us. We had both gone to medical school. We had both done a residency in internal medicine. We had both done advanced training in a subspecialty, Steve in cardiology and me in hematology. We loved medicine. We loved taking care of patients. We loved the challenge of trying to fit our training to their needs. But we were both curious, and so we thought we ought to give a serious try at medical research, and that brought us both to St. Louis, to the lab of a man named Phil Majerus, who was a physician, a hematologist, but also a scientist. I was too naive to understand, I'm sure Steve did before he arrived, but where we came was an extraordinary place. It was a division of hematology with physicians who also did scientific research, and the heart of it was the lab of Phil Majerus, where Steve and I joined. And next door was the lab of Stuart Kornfeld. Both Kornfeld and Majerus were in their 40s at the time, and within a few years, both of them were elected to the National Academy of Sciences, an amazing achievement. And in their labs at the time were an amazing group of trainees, postdoctoral fellows with PhD and MDs, and graduate students pursuing their PhD degrees. And over the years, almost all of those young trainees went on to remarkable careers in medical research. It was an amazing environment, and in that environment, Steve stood out. He stood out for the keenness of his intellect, but he stood out for his ability to engage with other people, and he learned from them. And so he became even wiser. Now, I have to say that Steve drove me crazy sometimes because I would flounder around doing experiments, making mistakes, trying not to make the same mistake again. But Steve always seemed to get to the heart of an issue, and he always knew how to design experiments. And so he'd come in the morning, and he'd get a result, and it was useful. And some of us stayed late at night because we didn't get that useful result. But Steve got things done, and he always went home to Susan and his family for dinner. Now, I was still a bachelor at the time, and so Steve and Susan were kind enough to invite me over to dinner a few times, and it was a lot of fun. And John and Allison, you're too young to remember, but I remember you, and I guarantee you, you were full of spit and energy then too. So Steve and I each spent 3 years in the lab in St. Louis, and then we parted ways. Steve went back to the University of Utah, where he began his academic career at the University of Utah, and I must confess, went to Texas. I went to the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, where I started my academic career. Now, my fellow Okies, I have to say there's some good things about Texas, because in San Antonio, I met my wife, Gigi, and that's where our son Eric was born. It was a good place. So over the next few years, I kept in touch with Steve, particularly at the annual meeting of physician scientists, where we presented the results of our most recent research. And it was at those meetings that I also met Steve's good friend, Guy Zimmerman, another physician who was a scientist at the University of Utah. And Steve and Guy and others there worked closely together, and it was fun. And I remember in particular a meeting around 1986 where I went over to the hotel room that Steve and Guy were sharing, and we stayed up late that night talking about life and science, fueled by a bottle of very good bourbon. Because Steve knew bourbon. He also knew good food and wine, and so did I, and we had a lot of memories about that too, but I can't tell you about that tonight. Okay. So a year later, in 1987, Gigi and Eric and I moved from San Antonio to Oklahoma City, where I joined OMRF. And then over the next 2 years in my lab, we made some discoveries that led us to intersect right at a major crossroads with the work that Steve and Guy and others in Utah were doing. And that led to a wonderful scientific collaboration in the 1990s where I visited Salt Lake City frequently. And it was fun, because what I found in Salt Lake was what I remembered from St. Louis, a vibrant intellectual environment where really bright and motivated trainees were doing really interesting things, prodded and encouraged and, if necessary, kicked by Steve and Guy and the others there. It was a lot of fun. Now, as the 1990s progressed, Steve's scientific achievements became increasingly recognized all over the world. And I was lucky enough to encounter him at a number of meetings. And some of the most fun meetings were the small ones, often held in Europe, where you got to really interact closely with really talented scientists from different backgrounds. And I have a lot of wonderful memories, but I'll share just a couple. One was at a meeting at Lake Chiemsee in Bavaria in the far south of Germany, where I arrived a little after Steve, and I went looking for him, and I found him on a beautiful day sitting in a chair on a dock that jutted out over this lake, reading a book. He wasn't reading a scientific paper, he was reading a book. I don't recall the book now, but it was probably a novel. It was probably by one of his favorite Western authors, but Steve read widely, and one of the things about Steve is that he kept his many interests in life balanced, and that all made him who he is and was. The other memory that comes to mind was at a small meeting in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And because that meeting was in the summertime, Gigi and our son Eric, who was then 7 years old at the time, they came along. And after the meeting was over, Gigi, Eric, and I drove north towards Salt Lake City, where I was scheduled to give a seminar at Steve's place at the University of Utah. But en route, we stopped in Moab, Utah. Steve and Susan had invited us. That's where Susan's parents had a home, and it's a place that became much beloved to Steve and Susan and their families. It's in a beautiful area near a number of national parks. And as we settled in that first evening, Steve started talking to our son Eric, who was 7. And Eric started talking about his passion for dinosaurs and for paleontology. Now, lots of kids love dinosaurs, but Eric was really interested. And he still is. He's become a filmmaker, but he's still passionate about dinosaurs and paleontology. Well, at that time in Moab, Steve picked up on that, and I don't know how he did this, but the next day, he arranged for us to go visit a dinosaur trackway on private land, not in a park. And on that memorable day, I remember we're walking along this trackway. And Steve is totally focused on Eric. And they're looking at these dinosaur tracks. And Steve is listening to Eric talk about these tracks, what they meant, what might have been happening millions of years ago. So to this day, Eric remembers this. Sorry. And what it tells you is that Steve focused on people, individuals, all backgrounds, and in this case, a child. And he made a difference because he zeroed in on you. And that's what made him so special. Now, in the 1990s, Steve's scientific stature continued to increase, but he also took on more and more leadership roles, first in human genetics and then ultimately as director of the Huntsman Cancer Center at the University of Utah. And because of all of his skills, we really wanted him to join our scientific advisory board at OMRF. This is a group of stellar scientists who visit once a year to advise us on our programs. And Steve agreed to serve, and he came annually for several years, provided his usual great insights, but lucky for us, he learned a lot about OMRF. So that in 2006, when we were looking for a new president, to me, Steve was a natural, an outstanding candidate, and thank goodness Lynn Kaysen and the board agreed, and thank goodness Steve thought this would be an exciting opportunity. So as they say, the rest is history. Over that 15 years, Steve had a major impact on OMRF and on the Oklahoma community. Now, I know Lynn will tell you about that impact in Oklahoma. I will tell you that within OMRF, Steve's impact was the same, and he did it because of the person he already was, by listening, encouraging, guiding, having confidence in us, knowing that because we're human, we make mistakes, but we can learn from mistakes, and so we got better. All of us got better. He could make hard choices when he had to. If somebody crossed an ethical threshold the wrong way, he took decisive action. But by the vast majority of times, it was the carrot, not the stick. It was the example and the encouragement that led us to do our best to become better. And we did become better. Now, 4 years ago, Steve developed cancer, and it was a shock to all of us. But Steve stayed being Steve. Engaging, kind, optimistic, and effective. And at no time more so than in the last year when the pandemic struck, when Steve was a voice of reason and hope, at a time when rumors and fear spread like wildfire. So we all knew that Steve was ill, and yet when he died, it seemed sudden to me, and it was hard to take. So I'll tell you that I miss him. I I miss his warmth. I would miss his wit. I miss his kindness. But I take comfort in the fact that someone who has such a big impact on you can never go away. So I recently read about a legendary Yale professor who was stepping down after decades of service. He was a noted scholar, but he was particularly beloved by his students because of the principles he taught them that he exemplified in his own life. And as I read those principles that his students recalled, I realized they fit Steve perfectly. He taught them to us, and by his example, he lived them. And those words go as follows. Being blessed with an incredible mind is only good if it goes along with character, with decency, humanity, and love, with goodness. So thank you, Steve, because you were all of these things. And thank you, Susan, for sharing Steve with us.
Well, it's an honor to be here today to remember our friend Steve. And I want to express my sympathy to Susan and all the members of the Prescott family for your loss. Steve was a good man, but Steve wasn't perfect. None of us can do that. What Steve was a perfectionist. We'd have dinner at Susan and Steve's house, and he would spend 2 days going to the Asian market, the farmer's market, the seafood market, all those places, finding ingredients for the marinades and sauces. Sunday afternoon, remember Susan, you and I and Donna and Steve would go play just a leisurely 9 holes of golf over at the country club. Steve hits one of his towering drives in the deep rough. We cannot go on till we find Steve's golf ball. It is painful, believe me. But he will not record a lost ball on a scorecard. And I guess that's because Steve is a winner. Steve is a winner, and I will tell you what he was. He was also a poor loser. And I think the reason was because he just didn't have much practice at it. One of Steve's biggest strengths, aside from his intellect and talent, was his ability to lead. And Steve and I would have this conversation about employees from time to time. Here's an example. Employee A wants this thing. Well, employee B also wants this thing. So if Steve gives this thing to A, B is going to resent A, B is going to resent Steve, A is going to feel guilty, and nothing works. So what Steve does is, I'm going to create another thing. Just as good, just a little different. And A gets one thing, and B gets the other thing. They're both happy. They both work together. And at the end of the day, none of them really realized that Steve was in control of the whole deal, right? He knew what he was doing. It's about managing relationships with people. He was the guru at that. Not just scientists and staff, but managing relationships with people, with donors, with our board of directors, with civic leaders. He did it all the time, with politicians and the public. And the result, look how far OMRF has come in the last 15 years. Look at this amazing state-of-the-art research tower. Steve was a family man. He cared deeply for his family, was totally committed to them, and look at the results. It's good, isn't it? Results is good. A close friend of mine a couple of years ago had a daughter. Steve knew that my friend. He'd seen him occasionally at football games, and he had a daughter who was a nurse in Dallas. She had an autoimmune disease and was not getting a good diagnosis. I mentioned it casually to Steve, never thought about it again. And the daughter called me about 6 months later in tears, thanking me. He says, "What are you thanking me for?" She says, "Well, Steve Prescott called me, spent lots of time on the telephone with me. He got me an appointment at OMRF. I didn't get a good diagnosis in Dallas, but I did at OMRF. I'm getting treatment, and I feel a whole lot better. Thank you so much." I bet that's happened to me I don't know how many times with Steve, and I know many of you out there have had the same experience. You have a loved one with a health issue or a medical problem, and he takes care of it. Steve does that because he was a good man. He was unselfish. He didn't keep score. He didn't expect anything in return. He did it because he could do it, and it was the right thing to do. That is why all of us loved Steve and thought so much of him. Steve had the same effect on his peers. Following his passing, we sent out an email to a number of our former scientific advisory board members and other scientists that knew Steve, and we received an outpouring of emails from scientists across the country. I just brought a couple. Let me just read a couple of them. These are from well-known scientists all over the country. Dear Mr. Kaysen, I'm very sorry to hear the sad news. Dr. Prescott was a wonderful leader and human being. It is a huge loss for the scientific community. Dear Mr. Kaysen, Steve was a giant in our field and a larger-than-life person. I join all the OMRF community in mourning his loss, but more in celebrating his life. My mental image of Steve will be in his house, near the bar with a glass of Pappy's, I remember that, in hand, a grin on his face expounding on some erudite subject of choice, from Southwest geography to stem cell research. Dear Lynn, thank you for letting me know about Steve. What a huge loss for OMRF, for science, and all of us who considered him a valuable friend. Steve had an impact on all of us with an enduring legacy of building OMRF and making the world a better place. I have a lot of these emails. Steve didn't have an enemy. To the contrary, everybody that knew Steve wanted to be his friend. Rod mentioned back in 2005, it was Rod who knew Steve and talked to us about Steve being a candidate for the position of president. They'd known each other a long time, and there was a lot of mutual respect. So first time I called Steve, we spent about 30 minutes on the telephone, and I think maybe we spent 2 minutes talking about OMRF. The rest of the time, we talked about philosophical questions like whether Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys were really the king of Western swing, and Ray Benson asleep at the wheel, and then I had to listen to him moan and groan about the sorry state of Texas A&M football. We continued to talk on the phone frequently, and finally Steve and Susan came to Oklahoma. And after he left, I said to my wife, you know what? I don't think I ever offered him a job. and then she said, well, you know what? I don't think he ever accepted it. But I do remember before he left, I said, okay, Steve, this weekend, why don't I put together a little employment agreement and send it to you? Okay. And if you got a lawyer, you can have your lawyer look at it. And he says, no, that's okay. I think we're good. I think we're good. So I think we signed it. I think we signed an employment agreement. I'm not sure. I don't know where it is. I've never had occasion to look at it. Yeah. I love working with Steve and talking with him about issues. We were in sync on absolutely everything. We would talk through issues. We always came out to exactly the same place together. And looking back, and I really mean this, I don't ever recall Steve making a wrong decision. Maybe some of them didn't work out like we wanted, but I never recall a decision that was wrong. Over time, we had little, you know how you have little inside jokes with people that are friends of yours, little buzzwords, play on words that nobody knew but us, and certainly nobody would think was funny but us. And now Rod mentioned bourbon, so on birthdays and Christmases, it was common for Steve to buy me a bottle of bourbon. And it was always a bottle of bourbon that nobody had ever heard of. I got a bottle of Kentucky Owl, Old Frosty, Old Rip Van Winkle. And the common thing about all these bourbons is they had a label, and on the label there was an old man in a rocking chair with a corncob pipe. And they all had the same. And I Googled these bourbons, and Google had no clue who they were. Occasionally, Steve and I would have a glass of Old Rip Van Winkle on the patio. And after we had a couple of glasses of Old Rip Van Winkle, we'd try to remember the words to some of those crazy old country songs. You know, songs like, What's Left of Me Just Won't Go Right. How Can I Miss You When You Won't Go Away? And the other evening, I sat on my patio and had a couple of glasses of Rip Van Winkle, and I thought, Steve won't be here anymore. He'll do the worst. Steve left us a legacy that will endure. What he has done is set the bar higher for all of us. He has made all of us better. What used to be okay at OMRF and wherever is not good enough anymore. Our expectations for ourselves and our future should be higher. At OMRF, we're beginning to look for a new president. I hear people say, wow, this is tough. These are going to be big shoes to fill. Yes, they are. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? By design, intentionally, Steve made those shoes so big, we're going to have to do everything we can, maximum effort, to fill those shoes. Well, there's a short scripture that I've read, which really reminds me of Steve. I'd like to close with that. In the book of Proverbs, one of the leading characters is this character called Lady Wisdom. If you ever read Proverbs, you know about Lady Wisdom. She's not really a person. She is a personification. She is a personification of wisdom, like Steve is a personification of wisdom. Let me read a little of it. Proverbs 3:13. Blessed is the man who finds wisdom, the man who gains understanding. For wisdom is more profitable than silver, and nothing you desire can compare with it. Lady Wisdom is the tree of life to those who embrace her. Those who lay hold of her will be blessed. By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding he set the heavens in place. My son, preserve sound judgment. Do not let it out of your sight. It will be light for you. Then you will go on your way in safety, and your feet will not stumble. And when you finally lie down, you will not be afraid. And when you finally lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Steve Prescott left the landscape of this world a richer place than it was before. God bless Steve Prescott. He was a good man.
Hi there. Rough day for everybody here. Susan, family, everybody, my favorite chef. My name is Danny Zalesko. I've known Steve for quite a while. We met when I was hit with colon cancer in 2003. Our mutual friend, Shep Gordon, who some of you know, introduced him to me, and I found out later that Shep had met Steve by way of Don Nelson, the basketball coach, who also had a problem, and Steve helped him out. And when Shep mentioned to Don that I was hit with this, he said, you better have him call Steve. So out of nowhere, I got a call from him, and that's how we met on the telephone. I explained everything best I could to him, and he goes, well, where are you going? What hospital are you going to? I said, Mayo in Scottsdale. He goes, oh, those guys. And I said, yeah, those guys, but they were the best I could find there. He goes, nah, you're in good hands. He goes, give me a phone number of your doctor. I'd like to give him a call. I said, great. So I called up the doctor. You know, he's a really nice guy. He was the guy that said when I went to visit him, you'll be back. Go get another opinion somewhere. Let's see what you come up with. So in the meantime, I asked if it was okay if Steve would call him, and he kind of gave me a sniff. And he said, what's his name? I go, Stephen Prescott, and he genuflected. And I knew then who he was, and Shep would never, ever send me to somebody any less in such a situation. I'm happy that I became friends with him, and I am friends with him. I'll never be speaking in past tense about him because he's always going to be around me. That little voice in my head, like the other gentleman talked about, his ability to dissect things and give you a straight answer, whether it was about whiskey or music or medicine or your health or your friendship, was always spot on. Back to that Mayo thing, the funny thing that happened later was Steve called me back an hour later after he talked to him, and he said, I could tell there was a lot of people in the room. Can you find out how many there were? And it turned out that a call started with the 2 doctors, and there was 12 guys around the phone by the time he was done with them. And the thing that was so remarkable about that was when I went in there to get operated on, the treatment I got was unbelievable. It was like 4 seasons kind of treatment. I'm going, is this the way you guys are with everybody? I said, no. So I just will always thank him for almost 20 years ago, this happening. I mean, had they not looked so careful at me, maybe I wouldn't be here talking to you today. After 6 months of chemo and an intense operation, Shep and I got at least 30 rock stars to sign guitars for an auction to raise money for cancer research at the Huntsman Center in Salt Lake. And we never stopped doing that till this day. I'm so happy and so proud every time, every year, I get a call from Steve and I get to talk to Penny and Gina again about putting together the details for these shows that happen out here. He loved this place. He loved doing these shows here. He loved being a concert promoter. He thought that was the coolest thing. And I never really wanted to be a doctor because I never thought I would have it in me to do so, but vicariously I got to live through him. He kept most of his accomplishments under wraps. I didn't know about half of the stuff that he did until I read about him later. But it didn't matter because we knew he was something. He knew I was something. He treated me like I was him, like the way a guy of his stature should be treated. He treated everybody like that. So many times over the years, and he encouraged me to do this. I didn't just start doing this on my own, but he would ask me, demand of me, if there was anybody in trouble, anybody who couldn't get a straight answer out of their doctor or out of whoever they needed advice from. He made me, for a while he made me, and then after that just became common. He would talk to everybody and anybody. He talked to Ronnie James Dio when he was sick. And before he talked to him, he said, "What's your favorite song by him?" So I know what I'm talking about. And he picked out, I picked out The Last in Line, and he listened to it a few times. I said, "Did you call him yet?" He goes, "No, I'm still listening to the album." And Ronnie loved him. Unfortunately, he was too late. But one of my favorite stories about Steve was I was at this singer's house. His name was Chris Cornell, and his wife invited us to stay there in Ojai. And there's this beautiful negative edge pool, and I'm sitting there looking out at the mountains, and I'm thinking about my friend, another Steve in Chicago, lifelong friend who had Hep C, and he was failing. And I thought to myself, I put my promoter hat on. I'm at a rock star's house, and as a promoter, we get asked some outrageous things, as you can imagine. Get me this, get me that, do this, do that. So I'm thinking to myself, what if a road manager came up to me and said, "I got a guy with Hep C, and he's gonna die if he doesn't get a new liver." So I go, call Superman, call Steve Prescott. Steve, explain the story to him. He talks with his my friend's girlfriend, gets some more information, makes a phone call, and he goes, "Everything should be all right now." I said, "What?" "He needs a liver. He doesn't need a ride to the park." And he goes, "You'll see." He had a liver 4 days later. And I said, how did that happen? Did you have something to do with it?" He goes, "Well, I called them up and reminded them if they didn't get him the liver that they've been promising him for all these years, they were going to lose their $1.1 million grant from the government unless they get him the liver. If he dies, they don't make any money." And I said, "Did you do anything else?" He goes, "I told them we were prepared to fly him to Oklahoma and give him a liver." I never asked him where he was getting it from. But it worked, and he swore to me it wasn't a ruse. He said he could do it, and I believe him. And my friend, by the way, is still very much alive. and that was at least 15 years ago. Steve was a regular guy. I wore this in honor of him today. It says regular guy right there. I think he has this shirt, along with many others. He was always so happy when I would look at him when he approached me when we were getting together and he's wearing one of my shirts. We had this golf tournament called the Regular Guy Golf Tournament, which the motto is, if your lie sucks, improve it. Steve took care of that one. I have to tell just one story with filter, by request from Susan. Not the story, just the filter part. I think it was either after the guitar auction that we did. I think it was maybe the next day, part of that weekend, or the next year. But I was invited back, and Steve and Susan had a beautiful dinner in the backyard. The chef was there, did a great job. And they kept talking about a medical situation that was in the press. And I kept going back to the kitchen, getting another, it was brown, I don't know what it was, whiskey, I guess. So there was all this different stuff, I didn't know what it was. And finally I went back out and I told what some would consider a crude joke that went along with what was being talked about, but I didn't think it was that bad, and everybody was having a good time. I went back in after I finished. I mean, there was an outburst of laughter and applause, and suddenly it got quiet. And I went back in the kitchen, got another drink. I came back out, and the entire backyard was empty. Everybody left. They got in those vans, and they went back to the hotel, and Steve was standing there. He just said goodbye to the last person, and he was almost crying. He was laughing so hard. He goes, "Tell me that joke again." So I did, and he's told it back to me 100 different ways since then. And I know it was disturbing for some, but it was one of those moments that we had where we've always gone back to that one. Here's the part I'm just gonna go through this here. He was my personal Hall of Fame regular guy. He was truly my Superman. There are so many people that have to give him thanks and gratitude for being who he was, for being that guy with the bedside manner unequaled by anybody else. He was the doctor that would tell you stuff straight. He wouldn't kid around about those things, and he was smart, and if he didn't know something, he knew somebody that did, and he would bring them back to you and share them with you. We lost one of the greats here way too soon, and I'm so sad about that. I've actually picked up the phone to call him a couple times. We've been working all year long. We were working on booking Jackson Brown for the thing in here in October, and because of all the different changes in touring and this and that, he really wanted to do it. I talked to him myself about it, and I also let Jackson know what happened, and he said he promised to try to come next year. In the meantime, Emmylou Harris filled in, and I think that's very sweet of her. I mean, we love the fact, I love the fact that instead of booking a show to put on, sell tickets and all that, wherever I do that, I love this event here. I love it because I get to talk with Steve. I get to do a show with Steve in this place, and of course, without Gina and Penny, Steve would have been lost, because anything important, call them. He just, he liked the big stuff, like go ahead and do it, and he enjoyed that role, and I was so happy to share that with him. I wonder sometimes since then, what if I had never known him? What if I didn't get sick? Dr. J, I see him. I would have never met him. I mean, it's such a weird thing. I had to go through a crisis in order to meet one of my best friends in my world, and I was so lucky and so happy now that I have him, because we all have him forever. So I'm never really going to accept that with life there is death, but Steve will never die. He'll remain alive in my heart, along with yours. We're so lucky to have a friend, a comrade, a regular guy that made our lives so much better for knowing him. So with that, I'm going to quote some scripture from Steve Goodman and John Prine. I will stand around as long as you will let me, but I never did mind standing in the rain. You don't have to call me darling, darling. You never even called me by my name. On behalf of our friend, please allow me to say with the most respect I can summon up, thank you for loving Dr. Steve Prescott, because he loved you too, and you, and you, and you, and you. Thank you.
So thank you, Danny. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Rod. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I am Jeremiah Redstone, Steve Prescott's son-in-law, and I've been lucky enough to be in Steve's family for 27 years. Steve changed my life. I remember a lot of support from Steve, and I actually remember zero criticism, which is amazing because I know I got a lot of things wrong. When I was 21, I asked Steve if I could have his daughter's hand in marriage, right after I told him that we were going to have a baby. I'm sure he had some worries about a Yankee with no job marrying his daughter, but he said yes without hesitation, and he helped us build a wonderful life from that day on. As that life went along, we had children. Steve didn't like children. I mean, he didn't dislike them, but he thought they were way better when they could carry on a conversation. So when the grandkids were here, they would sit around and he would talk to them like adults. No small words, no baby talk. They went for drives in Steve's Porsche. It turns out the back seats in a Porsche are perfect for a toddler and no one else. They enjoyed delicately fried squash blossoms made by Steve and other gourmet foods that no toddler deserves. So in the end, he ended up with 3 elegant, well-spoken granddaughters who love to dine at fine restaurants. So thank you, Steve. As a young man, Steve developed a love for the outdoors, river running in Utah, ski patrolling at Brighton, hiking the desert with friends. This love of nature was always evident, and it was hiking the desert with Steve where I learned secret trails, the difference between a pictograph and a petroglyph. Just over a year ago, we went on Steve's last hike together. We were trying to find a set of petroglyphs called the Procession, a secret set that was down toward Mexican Hat in Utah. Steve had heard rumor of these petroglyphs years before, maybe 30 years before, and had searched this area multiple times, knocking on the door of, some very colorful characters in the area there with his sister-in-law, getting them very inaccurate descriptions of where they were. So we did a lot of research before we went on this last hike. We ended up in a canyon, and we were hiking up a 20-degree rock face for about 2 hours. At that time, Steve's body was pretty beat up. He'd been through chemo and surgeries and couldn't feel his feet. He didn't complain once that day. He hiked for hours with a smile on his face. We were approaching a cliff impasse at the top of this rock face, and we thought we'd been skunked again. The grandkids had been running out ahead, scouting out, looking for any petroglyphs they could find. We were about to turn back and give up when the kids found 2 little drawings on the rock face, and we figured we'd go another 500 feet. We turned a corner there, and suddenly before us, on the red rock wall, an expansive pictograph mural came into view. Hundreds of otherworldly characters, bighorn sheep, deer, and more, all converging in a mysterious formation. That was a beautiful day. So 4 years ago, I was standing on a corner in a little town outside of New York City called Sag Harbor when I got a call from Steve. He said he had serious news. When he described what they had found, I knew it was bad. Really bad. for most people, like 6 to 12 months bad. I don't want to talk about all the sickness and the hard times, but I did want to let you all know a couple things that he let me know and I felt was worth passing on. He wanted to be here, and he fought like crazy to be here, and I wish he still was. And he fought that fight with a grace and a style that I've never seen before. I'm a physician also. I've seen a lot of people face the end, and he did it amazingly. One morning, he woke up a little bit sore from a whole bunch of surgeries and chemotherapy, and he apologized to me for being such a downer about this whole thing. I literally couldn't remember a single time he had complained. So I told him that I didn't see him as a downer, and how much strength he had shown through the whole battle, and the good spirit he maintained throughout was the greatest example of how to face adversity. And in fact, we had some of our best times in those last 4 years. They were great. We had great conversations, wonderful meals, beautiful travel. We traveled to Moab, to New York, to Italy, to Mexico City. Steve took the whole family to Italy for he and Susan's 50th anniversary. We stayed in a Tuscan villa, and it was really a magical time. Also, Steve planned all his treatments. He wasn't going to skip a single treatment, but he also planned them really carefully so they didn't interfere with any of the family moments he wanted to have. It was really a miracle. So 25 years later, after I had approached Steve about marrying his daughter, I was approached by a young man who asked me for my older daughter's hand, and I said yes, without hesitation. I had learned one of Steve's theories over the years. That was that new family members were to be converted and incepted. That was, when you get the chance to welcome someone into the family, the goal was to bring them so close into the family that they could never imagine not being family. He considered it one of the greatest sports and a not-so-secret mission. So September 7th, 2019, Steve officiated the wedding of his eldest granddaughter. Steve was comfortable speaking in front of a crowd, as we know. And seeing him officiate at one of the best days in my life, with pride and skill, and a heart full of joy, was a dream come true. So this not-so-secret mission of bringing people into the family extended far beyond Steve's relatives as well. What I see looking around here is a group bonded by one of Steve's deepest held philosophies. I see it in family, in the friendships, in the scientists he mentored and collaborated with, and in his business colleagues. If he found a person he believed in, he would invest in that person. Invest time, invest thought, emotion, support, for this is what truly pays back in the end. He took great pleasure in watching the people he worked for and with flourish, and with his help, he took great pleasure in supporting the members of the community. Sometimes he showed the support by helping find a specialist for a rare medical condition, sorting through every doctor in the country to find the right person. There likely isn't someone in this room that hasn't been touched by Steve's help and care at a time of need. In all of the years I knew him, I only heard Steve voice one regret. The one regret he did express to me was not being there around for his wife and children when they needed him, when he was working so hard to build his career early on. It was this work that allowed such a beautiful family life that I am lucky enough to be part of today. So I will pass on this message from Steve because I think he had a hard time saying it. He wishes he would have been there more when you needed him in the early years. But by the time the grandkids came along, he had that figured out completely. That is not to say he had stopped being a force at work, but now he would have his granddaughters come sleep over at the Plaza Hotel and then limousine them to school in the morning, to their delight, before going off to sit on the board of some big company or settle a deep scientific question. And family meals became a priority. We spent so much time sitting in Susan and Steve's backyard, which happens to be the best restaurant I've ever been to. Steve's cooking and a cold drink will always be one of the best experiences I can imagine. Love. Susan and Steve were high school sweethearts. I missed the first 43 years, but the stories are legendary. In these last 4 years, Susan went through all of this with him, and in the end, was helping take care of him every minute of every day, caring emotionally and physically in a way that most people wouldn't have the strength to do. Susan and Steve's children, John and Allison, were there when Steve wanted. He wanted his family around more than anything, and they helped take care of Steve for weeks straight at the hardest of times, cooking, caring, and supporting their mom and dad. I also learned how amazing Steve's friends were, always there with a kind word, a bottle of bourbon, an emergency plane ride on your private plane to Salt Lake City for surgery. One friend, Bill, spent every minute of every single chemotherapy session sitting with Steve, keeping him company and keeping an eye on every single medical decision, and endlessly searching the entire world for all studies and trials that might give Steve a cure or a little more time with us. To all of his amazing family and friends, I want to say thank you. I cannot tell you how much it helps, and we will be forever grateful. In conclusion, I want to thank Steve for teaching me about the most important things in life: fine food, good bourbon, desert hiking, backcountry skiing, the Texas songwriters, brisket, how to face adversity, and most importantly, family and love. Thank you.
Thanks to each of you. Will you pray with me? Loving God, thank you for the life and legacy of Steve Prescott. Thank you for what he meant to each person here. Bless our memories of him. Let them remain vivid and an inspiration to do meaningful work, seek answers to problems, enjoy music, laugh often, eat well, help others, and love fully. Be with Susan and their family and close friends. When days ahead feel empty or sad, Lord, hold them close and help them remember the love that surrounds them at this moment. Bless the work of this place, OMRF. We know the spirit of Steve will always be embedded here, just as it lives on in the hearts of all of us. Be with us as we go forth into living, with the reality of death only serving to remind us of the holiness of life. It's in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit I pray. Amen. Amen.
And Bob Wills is the king of Western slang.
Thank you all so much for joining us this morning to celebrate the life of Dr. Prescott. The family would like to greet you and thank you for your attendance today, but we'd like to ask you to remain seated for just a few moments as we allow the family to be moved to the receiving area. Once they're situated, we'll all follow. So for now, just please stay seated. Thanks again for coming. You're welcome to leave.